Greetings. So, my wife and I were recently discussing a new film that came out this year titled EO. It's a Polish film which is sort of from the perspective of a donkey. And, the viewer gets to see the hardships that this donkey faces as it goes throughout its life. And, the film draws in the viewer and causes the viewer to have like an emotional connection with the donkey, feel a certain empathy for the donkey. And a lot of people connected that film to an older film from the 60s titled Hasard, Balthazar, which is very similar in the sense that it generates a certain empathy with a donkey, as the viewer sees the suffering and hardships of the donkey from the donkey's perspective, essentially. And, my wife had pointed out that you get a similar situation with a recent Korean film called Okja, which is about a fictional genetically modified pig that sort of it looks more like a hippo, but whatever the case, the film really captures the emotion of and the suffering and the hardship of this particular fictional species. And once again, it sort of invites the viewer to feel empathy for the animal. And this sort of approach is actually quite ancient. There's a book from the second century written in Latin called Metamorphoses by Apuleius, and Augustine called it Asinus Aureus, which means the golden donkey. It's known popularly in English as the golden ass. And that work is about a man who, through like magic, a man is turned into a donkey, and eventually he gets out of that, but he recounts like his suffering, and all the hardships that he went through while he lived as a donkey. And Peter Singer, the animal rights activist and ethicist, has talked about how that book, the quote-unquote golden ass or the golden donkey, is one of the earliest known works to sort of pull in the reader, and like I said, to build a certain empathy with an animal, to get the reader to think about the plight and suffering of animals. And so I was talking about this with my wife, and I was saying there's another ancient work that I'm aware of that sort of does the same thing, not exactly, but it has this sort of idea that can, be a bit thought-provoking about the rights of animals. Now, naturally, I think people who are familiar with the subject might say, the Pythagoreans had these kind of concerns, ancient Hindus had these kind of concerns, but there's also an interesting story in the Talmud, in the Babylonian Talmud, and that's what I have here. This is a copy of the Babylonian Talmud. I'm going to be specifically looking at tractate Baba Metsia. And because there's, I would say it's a short story, but it's my favorite story in the Talmud. And now I understand someone might say, oh, well, you're a Christian, you have a favorite story in the Talmud. What I would say about the Talmud is that from a Christian perspective, the Talmud is sort of just a mix of many things. Like you're going to find offensive things and things you find absurd and even blasphemous things, but there are also interesting insights and interesting stories. And I would say this is one of the interesting stories in the Talmud, and it has to deal with, in a sense, concern for animals. So I'm going to turn directly to the relevant text. And what we're going to be looking at is, as I said, it's going to be a tractate Baba Metsia, specifically page 85a, or daf 85a. And before I get to the animal part, I hope you forgive me, I'm also going to briefly segue into Rashi's commentary on this text to show a bit of his, subject that interests me is a bit of his medieval use of medieval French to elucidate the text. And, how sometimes that ceases to be helpful when you reach modernity. But whatever the case, jumping right in, I'm going to try and find my place. Yeah, so it's talking about this person here, Rabbi, which is Judah ha-Nasi, right? So Yehuda ha-Nasi, Judah ha-Nasi, and it's going to be talking about the suffering that he and others endured, but I'm just going to be focusing on the suffering of Rabbi, and again, that's Judah ha-Nasi. So opening up at the relevant part, right, it says, Amar Rabbi Habibin Yisurin, so he says, beloved suffering, and it's talking about the suffering that he endured, and I guess he endured it with a certain thankfulness to God. But the text goes on to say, referring to his suffering, it says, Kibel ale tlesar shnei, he received upon him for 13 years. Shit besmirta, 6 years. 6 of those years he had smirta, and I'm going to go to Rashi's commentary to define that. Ushva, and 7 of those years, besvirna, and I'm saying svirna because Rashi understood this to have a yod that you don't see here. So now I don't know what Smirta and Svirna mean, but we're going to go to Rashi's commentary really quickly because he defines these texts. So regarding, and then I'll get to the part about the animals. Regarding Smirta, this is the commentary of Rashi on the Talmud. Rashi defines it as Eben Shebemakom Katanim. It's a stone in the place of the small parts. So apparently it's referring to like kidney stones, right? And then as for Svirna, right, he says it's Choli Shebetoch Hape. This is a disease which is in the inside of the mouth, right? And then he gives its name, Ushmo, and its name is Mishge, or Mishga. Now, this is interesting. For anyone who saw my video on medieval French in a medieval Hebrew commentary, this is an instance where Rashi, for his audience, because Rashi was writing in France, he would occasionally transcribe French words. But again, he's writing around the 11th century, so or 10th or 12th century. So this is like 1,000-year-old French. But he, for his audience, his initial French audience, he would transcribe French words into Hebrew characters to sort of clarify what was being referred to. And unfortunately, French evolved, so it's no longer clear. But whatever, this is fascinating because, so again, we're talking about a disease in the mouth, and he says that it's referred to in French as mishge. Now, there is a French word today in modern French. Mishge means the, like thrush, right? An infection in the mouth, mishge. And it comes from muscata in Latin. So it's interesting because the modern French dropped off the S in muscata, in the Latin muscata, but in the, 1,000 years ago, Rashi was at the halfway point, so there was sort of still an S phoneme. So from muscata to mige, he was in the middle with something like misge or miska or mishga. I thought that was interesting, but whatever the case. So the point is here is that the text is referring to the suffering of Rabbi. He had kidney stones and he had something like thrush and he had it for years. And then, referring to the suffering, this is where the animals are going to come in, right? Now, the text goes on to refer to the suffering of both Rabbi and then another person, Rabbi Eliezer, right? But we're going to focus on the suffering of specifically Rabbi, right? So you have the Yisure de Rabbi, the suffering of Rabbi, and it says, by the way, this Ayin Yod, this is an acronym for Al Yadeh, literally on the hands of, right? So the sufferings of Rabbi were Al Yadeh Ma'aseh Ba'u. They came on account of, that's Al Yadeh, literally on the hands of, but more specifically because of or on account of, Al Yadeh Ma'aseh Ba'u. They came on account of an act, of something which was done. His suffering came, and then the text goes on to say, Al Yadeh Ma'aseh Halchu. They also departed, they left, they literally walked away. His sufferings left, departed on account of an act, right? So now the text is going to elaborate on what's being referred to. So, Al Yadeh Ma'aseh Ba'u. So, on account of an act, his sufferings came, right? Maihi, the text asks, what's that referring to? And it says, Dechahu igla. This is referring to a baby cow, a calf. By the way, when the Bible talks about the golden calf, it's egel. This is the Aramaic equivalent, igla. It's basically the same word with the definite article. So, there was a calf. Dechawu qamamtu. Some people were leading it, him, leshchita, to slaughter, to, basically they were leading this baby cow to have its throat slit, it was being prepared for food. Azal, it went, the baby calf went. Talya lereshe, it hung its head, bekanfe de Rabbi. Now this is actually, I find this kind of beautiful because if you read this literally, the baby cow hung its head under the wings of Rabbi. Now, in the commentary of Rashi, he clarifies, he said it actually means tachat kanfe kesuto, so under the wings, or basically the flaps of his garment, right? But I find it more beautiful that the garment isn't explicitly mentioned in the Talmudic text, because it even fits with like a modern English metaphor, in the sense that this baby cow tried to hide itself under the wings, under the protection of Rabbi. And so, now by the way, this
Ka is sort of like an untranslatable word. I would generally say something like so. But whatever the case, bahi, and the baby cow, it was crying out. So it tried to hide itself, it tried to place itself under the protection of Rabbi, of the Nasi, of someone with great authority amongst the people. And it cried out. It was, it was being led to slaughter, and it went to him for help. And Amarle, he said, Rabbi said to this baby cow, Zil lechach notzarta, go to what you were formed for, go to what you were created for. Basically, he's pushing it away, saying you were basically created for this, to be slaughtered for food, to be turned into veal. And then it's Amre, it was said, now the implications that this is being said in the heavens, Amre hoil, because, hoil welaka merachem, because there's no mercy, Letuale yisurin, upon him suffering. Remember how it was said that sufferings came to him because of an act? Well, the text is saying this act, that callous indifference that he showed for that baby cow that was coming to him to be saved from slaughter and tried to seek his protection because he was so callous, the text is saying that as a result of that, the heavens declared, Ale yisurin, sufferings be upon him be sufferings, right? But then what about the other half of what was accounted? Remember it said that, his sufferings walked, they left, they departed on account of an act, right? So what was that act? And here the text is going to say it. Yom Achad, one day, Hawaka Kansha Amte de Rabbi Beta. So the female servant, the maid servant of the house of Rabbi was sweeping, literally gathering. She was gathering things up. So essentially she's cleaning up his house, right? And it says Hawa Shadia, there was Bnei Karkushta, they were young, the children of the Karkushta, of the weasel, some sort of, rodent-like creature. The dictionaries I've looked in all say weasel. So, this woman is cleaning up the house of Rabbi, and she finds this nest of baby weasels, right? And she started sweeping and gathering up these baby weasels, right? Amarla, he said to her, Rabbi said to his maidservant, Shipkinhu, leave them, right? Don't do what you're doing, right? Spare them, essentially, right? And by the way, you see this root, the shin bet kof root, for those of you who know in the gospel, the Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, that's the same verbal root. Sabachthani it means to abandon, to leave. So he's saying to her, Shipkinhu, leave them, right? Don't sweep them up. Don't basically dispose of this nest of baby weasels. And then he winds up quoting the Psalms. He says, Ketiv, as it's written, ורחמיו על כל מעשיו, his mercy is upon all his creation, all his works, right? He's quoting Psalm 145. Basically, he's saying, spare this nest of baby weasels because the Psalms say that the mercy of the Lord is upon all his creation. And then Amrei, it was said. So again, the heavens are speaking here. Hoil, because Umerachem, because there's mercy. Nerachem ale. Now we will be merciful upon him. So the implication of this interesting text is that when Rabbi, this great Talmudic sage, at least from the Talmudic perspective, showed callous indifference to the suffering of an animal, he wound up suffering for over a decade. And then when he showed mercy to something as simple as baby animals, to baby weasels, then he received mercy and his suffering ended. I just wanted to share that. Like I said, this is one of my favorite texts in the Talmud. It gets you to think about, the plight of animals and the need to even be merciful to animals that serve as food, that animals that are, considered pests in our home, And so I thought you'd find that interesting, and that's all. So I'll close here. Hope you found that interesting. As always, I look forward to the comments of others. I suppose we could even discuss the story of Balaam's donkey in the book of Numbers. There's that fascinating text where the angel tells Balaam, had your donkey tried to pass me, I would have spared her and killed you. That's a fascinating text as well that's relevant here. But like I said, I look forward to the comments of others, and just want to share this interesting Talmudic story. And on that note, God bless.